Hi, I'm Robert Bennett, Field Sales Agronomist with Growmark in the Southern region. This segment of our training, we're going to focus on the corn root system, and we're going to begin by washing off these pre-dug plants and then identifying the different root systems that the plant has. So first of all, I'm just going to grab my hose from my water source and begin washing. We want to get as much dirt off as possible in order to get a clear view of the roots. So once we've got the roots washed off, we can begin to take a look at the root structure and identify the different parts. So let's take a look at these two different plants and identify the root structures on each. The first one we'll take a look at is a V2 plant. We've got two showing leaf collars on this particular plant. We've got the flag leaf and we've got the first true leaf, which shows a collar as well. So we've got two collars. Just some of the things to point out on a particular plant. First of all, of course, is that we have the seed. This is the seed that was planted, contains all the information that this plant needs to produce a crop. The first structure I'd like to point out on this plant is the radicle. It's the first structure that emerges from the seed, and we know it's the radicle because it comes out of the tip of the seed. It's one that emerges first, goes down and begins supporting this plant. The next structure that we would point out are the lateral seminal roots. They come out opposite of the radicle, and they are the second system then that this plant uses for support early on. In addition to that, the part between the seed and the crown of the plant is the mesocotyl. This is the part that goes towards the surface, pushes the coleoptile out of the ground. Also on this plant we can see even at a V2 stage that we're starting to develop nodal roots. The nodal roots are the root system that will take over for the plant once we get to about V3 and beyond, when the radicle and the seminals begin to take less of a role as far as supplying the plant. One other thing to note on this plant would be seed depth, and you can normally tell seed depth if you take a look at the crown and add about 3/4 of an inch to it. You know about where that seed was planted. And so on this particular plant here, we had about 1.25 to 1.5 inches planting depth based on that information. So we just took a look at the root structure of a V2 plant, and now let's take a look at the root structure of a V6 plant. First, we'll start off by understanding why this is a V6 plant. Again, it's all about counting leaf collars from the first up to the last exposed leaf collar. And if we do that, we find out that this is the 6th leaf collar that's exposed, making this a V6 plant. The root structure on this plant is going to be very similar to the V2 plant that we just looked at, only a little more mature from the standpoint of growth stage. So again, the first thing we want to take a look at is the kernel, which is the planted seed, which we can identify as being right here. And once we've identified where the kernel is, we can then identify all of the different root structures. Again, first off, we'll take a look at the radicle, which is the first emerged root structure out of the kernel. It's the one that comes out of the tip of the kernel and begins to grow down, the first root structure to sustain the life of this plant. Opposite of the radicle are the lateral seminal roots, which come out of the opposite side of the kernel, and they again are the second root structure, and they grow down as well, the first two root structures out of the kernel. Coming out of the top of the kernel then is the mesocotyl, which is the part that pushes the coleoptile, the emerging part of the plant, through the ground. So between the seed and the crown, we find the mesocotyl. Other root structures are the nodal roots, which you can see toward the top of this, the mesocotyl. The nodal roots are the roots that emerge from each of the early nodes of a corn plant and eventually take over water transportation and nutrient transportation for this plant. Once again, we can understand seeding depth by looking at the distance between the kernel and the crown and adding about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch, which will tell us where that kernel was dropped. So we've just looked at the root structures of a V2 and a V6 plant and been able to identify each of the different root structures that this plant possesses. And as you can see, again, these are very important to know and understand in better understanding the agronomic principles behind a corn plant.